I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. On the Senate floor Thursday, Senator John Cornyn reflected on recent mass shootings across the country. A recent spate of mass shootings has brought the gun reform debate back into the national spotlight. Cornyn expressed his optimism that bipartisan action can be reached that still, quote, protects the rights of law-abiding citizens under our Constitution. He pointed to the bipartisan Fix NICS Act, which he worked on with Democratic Senator Chris Murphy after the 2017 Sutherland Springs shooting. Listen in for the Texas Republicans' full remarks.
Over the last couple of weeks, many of us have spent a lot of time thinking about the horrific shootings in Uvalde, Philadelphia, Buffalo, and elsewhere. Unfortunately, these are familiar scenes that we've seen before. And we'd like to try to find a way to reduce the likelihood of their reoccurrence in the future, if there's anything we can do here in the Senate to make that possible. So I've been working particularly with Senator Murphy, who was my partner on the Fix NICS bill that we passed in 2018. Senator Murphy comes from a blue state, Connecticut. I come from a red state, Texas. And yet, in that example, we were able to take the horrible events of Sutherland Springs, where innocent parishioners were gunned down at a small Baptist church outside of San Antonio, and take that out of that tragedy something good, which is a bill we called Fix NICS, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. Since that was signed into law, 11.5 million new records have been uploaded into the background check system, and I believe that has saved lives. You recall in that case, the shooter was a veteran of the United States Air Force, but unfortunately he had a troubled history. Felony convictions, domestic violence, mental health adjudications, none of that was in the background check system. It should have been, and it would have disqualified him had it been known. But he did what so often happens, he lied and then he bought. The lie and buy, and tragedy ensued. We were all sickened by these shootings, and we're hyper aware of the public interest. The most common refrain I hear is, do something. Do something. Unfortunately, it gets a little less specific after that, what exactly should be done. And that's where the hard work begins. But as before, I'm optimistic that we can find something that protects the rights of law-abiding citizens under our Constitution, under the Second Amendment, who I believe are not a threat to public safety, and focus on people with criminal records, people with mental health challenges, like young Salvador Ramos in Uvalde, Texas, like Adam Lanza at Sandy Hook. The profile is pretty well established. Young, alienated, disaffected, mentally challenged boys who lack access to treatment, which will help them manage their mental illness, and who descend into a pit of despair, ultimately resulting in their desire not only to harm themselves, but to take other people with them. That profile is well established in the scientific literature, and the New York Times did an excellent piece a couple of weeks ago on that profile. And so I think that gives us a little bit of a roadmap for the sorts of things we might do to deal with that. What makes this more challenging than, for example, the Fix NICS bill after Sutherland Springs is that was a single point of failure. Here we see multiple points of failure, and I think we need to address as many as we can. So as I mentioned, the mental health issue looms large. We know that during the 2 years where many students were isolated at home, trying to keep up with their studies virtually, Many of them have languished. Many of them have fallen behind. And because they've been isolated from their peers at a time when their social development is the most important, many of them have fallen into despair, exacerbating underlying problems that they may have in the first place. So trying to figure out how to support our schools and our communities with resources needed to address the mental and emotional health of people who are struggling, particularly young students. That seems like an obvious area that we could work on together. Obviously, school security is important. The initial reports in Uvalde were that the door was propped open, that Salvador Ramos entered. Later, we found out that no, it wasn't propped open, but the lock didn't work. He just walked right in. And there are a lot of studies and best practices when it comes to what is necessary to secure our schools. If we can secure our airports post 9/11, we can secure our schools to make sure that people who should come in and out of those schools can do so relatively easily, but that outsiders cannot, and particularly those who are a threat to their safety of those students. I think all of us want to try to find ways to reduce the likelihood of something like this happening again. And school districts across the country are eager to get our help and guidance to harden their infrastructure, to provide for the personnel, resource officers, that's the local police officer on the school campus. Those are things that I think would diminish the likelihood of another Uvalde. And so mental health and school safety seem to me as kind of no-brainers in a sense, where I don't think there's a lot of division between that side of the aisle and this side of the aisle. But we're also looking at ways to keep guns out of the hands of people who already, by law, are prohibited from having them. I'm not talking necessarily about expanding the background check system. I want to make sure the background check system works. And what makes this challenging is Salvador Ramos showed up after his 18th birthday as if he was born yesterday. For purposes of the background check system, there was no insight into his many mental health challenges or terroristic threats of fellow students, potentially drug use, other things that if he were an adult, he could not pass a background check. But because of the fact that juvenile records are typically sealed and are not part of the NICS review, the merchant who sold him the firearms he used didn't know anything about his track record. But we know now, as I said earlier, that he fits a familiar profile. He shot his own grandmother because she wanted him to go back to school after being out of school for the last 2 years. He engaged in self-mutilation, self-cutting, tortured animals, made threats against his fellow students, threatened sexual assault against his fellow female students, and made threats that he would, in fact, do what he ultimately did online. He was a ticking time bomb. And so if there's some way for us to look back into the sorts of records that would disqualify an adult if they had occurred post-18, because they would have been public records available to the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, if there's a way to look back and identify people like Salvador Ramos who, by virtue of his mental health and other problems, we would know should not be able to purchase a firearm legally. A couple of states, I think it's South Carolina and Virginia, voluntarily upload mental health adjudications for 17-year-olds. We can't compel other states to do that, but we can sure we can facilitate other states doing so and incentivize their populating the NICS background check system with this necessary information for juveniles who ultimately will end up, they'll turn of age and be able to buy a firearm. And we need to know ahead of time, for purposes of the background check system, what those records look like. So there are a number of things that we could do. There's one suggestion is, for example, to take a look at the background check process itself for 18 to 21-year-olds in particular, since that's the population that we're focusing on as based on this profile. Under current law, if you go in and buy a firearm and you have a clean record, you can pass your background check pretty quickly. In 90% of cases, that's actually what happens. The average processing time is 2 minutes. In most of those, or in those cases, the system returns a binary result. You either pass or you don't pass, you fail. And when we fail, that means you can't purchase a firearm. Now, the Congress, the Senate in particular, Senator Coons from Delaware and I sponsored a bill that would notify local police when somebody goes in to take a background check and fails because they don't qualify. Many times, the local law enforcement knows more about these people and would be interested to know that they tried to illegally purchase a firearm and were denied. But in about 10% of the gun purchases, the background check is not resolved immediately. The system returns a yellow light, which means additional review is required. For example, if you have a common name like John Smith, the search may pull records for somebody else, for the wrong person, with the same name who was prohibited from purchasing a gun. It could also be caused by incomplete criminal history. For example, somebody is convicted of assault, but on further examination, you find out it was domestic violence, which is a prohibited category. And you'd also learn whether it was a felony or a misdemeanor. In those cases, the FBI, under current law, already has 3 days in which to complete the background check. The problem is, under current law, if they don't finish, the seller still sells the gun, and we have an incomplete record. Dylan Roof, I believe, was the name of the shooter at the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina. As it turned out, he had a misdemeanor drug offense that was not uploaded into the background check system. Now, it is a disqualifying condition if you are addicted to or a frequent user of illegal drugs. But because the background check system did not allow enough time to include that information, maybe, just maybe, he would have been denied the purchase of the firearms that he ultimately used to kill those innocent people that day. So what we're looking at is the possibility of in those cases where there's what I'll call a yellow flag or an indication that further review is necessary, an extended period of time for this class of purchasers between 18 and 21 for the background check system to complete their review. Well, I've said it before and I'll say it again. I don't believe law-abiding, mentally well gun owners are going to commit mass shootings or are a threat to public safety. I know within the Senate, we've got a number of people who are sportsmen, who enjoy target shooting, let's say, who believe that they need to exercise their Second Amendment rights in order to protect their family and their homes. They're not a threat. So blanket limitations or prohibitions on those law-abiding citizens who are not a threat to public safety and never will be, to me, strikes as overreach. And we're not talking about a discretionary right. We're talking about a constitutional right. And so But I do believe that the Second Amendment and sound public policy are not mutually exclusive here. And that's the needle we're trying to thread here. So adding juvenile records to the NICS system is a common sense way to ensure we have a complete picture of the buyer's history. And then, of course, there is the scandal of our mental health delivery system in the United States today. Back in the 60s, when people who had mental health challenges were institutionalized, we finally figured that that didn't work very well. It was inhumane. And the theory was that there would be created some safety net in communities across the country where people could turn, where the police, if they answered a 911 call and they realized somebody's not, this isn't a criminal, this is somebody going through a mental health crisis, where the police could take people where they could actually get help, get treated, get counseling, and get better. That doesn't exist today in many communities. In the major cities, perhaps, even in suburban areas, but Uvalde, Texas, population 15,000, not so much. So we're looking at ways to expand the community-based mental health system. Senator Stabenow and Senator Blunt have a great proposal that would extend a current 8-state pilot program nationwide. Now, is that solely related to what happened at Uvalde or what happened in Buffalo or what happened in Philadelphia? No, but it would address the larger underlying challenge of more and more Americans falling through the cracks. And while we know most people with in a mental health crisis are not going to commit acts of violence, we also know that 60% of the gun-related deaths are suicides. And as it occurred to me, like a light went off in my head, Salvador Ramos, Adam Lanza, and others of this profile of young men, in addition to the multiple homicides they commit suicide. They know they're not going to make it out alive. And so addressing this mental health crisis that affects our country, and particularly where we fail these young men who feel like they have nowhere else to turn, who become increasingly isolated, become increasingly desensitized to the idea of taking someone's life because they're sitting in their room playing video games, killing people virtually all the time, and then in their bizarre fantasies decide to extend those fantasies to taking not only their own life, but the life of other innocent people. So this is challenging, Mr. President. There's no doubt about it. But we can do this. We can do this. Sometimes politics is called the art of the possible. And I think this is possible. Is it going to be perfect? Are we going to not have to revisit some other scenario where people have fallen through the cracks or where vulnerabilities are exposed? No, we can't be sure that this is one and done. But I do believe there is a sense of urgency, not only here in the Congress, but in the White House and across the country. We've all heard from our constituents who are in anguish over what has happened in Uvalde and elsewhere. The cry is to do something. Like I said, that's not very specific. And I understand. But it's up to us to try to find what is the right set of policies that would respect the rights of law-abiding citizens under the Constitution, but at the same time address what we know is a huge mental health crisis in this country, and make sure that the systems that are in place work like the National Instant Criminal Background Check system. We need to populate that system with the relevant information that would disqualify somebody if they were an adult, if it occurred while they were a juvenile. And there are ways we can do that. We can incentivize that. We can take a look back in some cases. We can allow the National Instant Criminal Background Check system in those limited cases where they need to do further review to see that the information is complete. We can figure this out. And I think on a bipartisan basis, there's a will to do so. Around here, if there's a will, there's a way. And I believe we do have the will, and we will find a way. Thank you, Mr. President.
The clerk